Hello, and thank you for joining me while I give my presentation on transformative learning. My name is Amy Randall McSorley, and I'm a doctoral student at Walden University. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to take a moment to pause and think about transformative learning. Not only how it has taken place in your life, but how you have also created environments for transformative learning, perhaps in your classroom. And then finally, at your organization where you are an educator, where do you see the challenges for transformative learning? I'd like you to think about these things as we move forward with the presentation. About the presentation, I have a couple objectives I want to make sure that we cover, and those include that I want to be sure that I provide for you information that aids in the understanding of Mezirow's transformative learning theory. No doubt you already are familiar with the theory. I'm hoping that I provide some additional information for you and something new for you to reflect upon. My second objective is to provide information regarding the considerations for creating a transformative learning environment. Throughout this presentation, I will be referring to the work of multiple researchers. So I want to mention that if you look at the last page of your handout, you will see a full list of these references. So let's start by talking about the work of Merriam, Caffarella, and Baumgartner, 2007, who found that transformative learning is about a dramatic change in how we see ourselves and the world in which we live. In fact, that you have to have a dramatic change in order for this to take place. They also mentioned that you'll see interchangeably used transformational and transformative learning, that they are very similar in what they mean. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to try to stick to transformative learning since that was what Mezirow used when he referred to his theory. The difference between transformational learning and informational learning is that transformational learning changes what we know, whereas informational learning expands what we know into new territory. So it really changes our personal and our worldview. There are three components, main components, that create the mental construction of transformative learning, and those are experience, inner meaning, and reflection. According to Cranton, 2011, transformative learning theory is a theory in progress. One of the ways Cranton liked to look at this was through Dirks's four-lens approach. The four lenses begin with Freire's liberation from oppression. And this is where Freire looked at learning, kind of comparing liberation learning with banking. So banking is where information is fed to the students, 1, 2, 3, fire it at them, and you memorize it and you have it all set so that you can take your test and pass and get an A. Whereas liberation was more of a relationship between the students and the educators, and in fact even some role sharing back and forth where the educators even learn from the students. And the idea here about this being liberation from oppression is that because you really internalize that information, you really learn how to use it, you're not just memorizing answers, you're able to move forward, experience transformative learning, and use this to improve your life and hopefully the lives of others through social change. So Freire felt that transformative learning was holistic. It involved mind, body, spirit, and your emotions, and also it was contextually, so it involved circumstances that form the setting of the learning as well. The second lens is developmental approach, and again this one was holistic and contextually based, intuitive as well. And the difference here though is, it takes place in a social setting, so maybe more public than the classroom. Then the third lens is that it is linked to spirituality. There's no real consensus on the meaning of spirituality, but it includes emotions and other ways of knowing. It's like a connection with something that's greater than oneself. The fourth one I saved for last because this is Mezirow. Now, Mezirow theory is that rational thought and reflection take place as a response to a disorienting dilemma. So earlier when we were talking about dramatic change, Mezirow is saying, this disorienting dilemma, this dramatic event takes place in your life, and because of that and our rational thought regarding that and our reflection, that's how transformative learning will take place. In Cranton's research, went far beyond looking at the four lenses we just discussed and actually created her own theory. And that starts with the introduction of connected knowing into theory. So connected knowing and relational versus independent and autonomous. So the idea is that connected knowing is relational based, whereas it's the opposite of independent and autonomous learning. So it takes place in groups and interactive models. Social change, which is a predominant goal of adult education, is a big part of the theory. But Cranton pointed out that Mezirow believed that individual transformation precedes social transformation. So in order for this social change to take place, transformational learning had to precede it. Another element of Cranton's theory concerned groups and organizations. There's a recent line of inquiry as it relates to transformative learning in groups and organizations. And it's interesting because the new line of inquiry about this is that even though learning can take place in groups, that we have a long history of understanding that and believing that in adult education, the idea that a group as an entity can learn is relatively new. So research continues and keeps growing more and more questions, which is what it's all about, right? Then there is the ecological view of Cranton's theory. And here we can look at the work of O'Sullivan and colleagues from the Transformative Learning Center at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. And the result of this was that it's not an individual process, but a personal process. So it involves experiencing a deep structural shift and basic premise of thought, feelings, and actions. And it alters our way of being in the world. So kind of semantics saying it's not, it's a personal process and not an individual process. And then there is the extra-rational approach. And this Cranton believed holds the most promise for expanding the theory because beyond the cognitive way of processing, personal, emotional, and imaginative ways of knowing, framing knowing as a problem of critical self-reflection leads us to neglect the emotional, spiritual, and imaginative aspects of transformation and yields a limited, fragmented perspective rather than a holistic, whole-person understanding. And this was a quote, so when you look in your handout at the references of Cranton 2011, that actually came from page 330. So now that we've covered a lot of background and other researchers' work, let's dive into the work of Jack Mezirow. I have a quote here for you that I think really sums it all up in a really great way. And this is actually from his work that you'll see in your reference sheet. Transformative learning, according to Jack Mezirow, the adult teacher must recognize both the learner's objectives and goal. The educator's responsibility is to help learners reach their objectives in such a way that they will function as more autonomous, socially responsible thinkers. So there we have it. It's about that transformative learning taking place so that we can move forward and help with social change. Mezirow developed his theory in 1978, and it was based on research that he had performed on women who returned to college after a hiatus, which is interesting because it's such a predominant theory, and it was started with research on women because a lot of the readings that we do, we see a lot of our historical research not based on studies of women. It has been the basis for much continued research and interest. In my research on this, I found that even though there's been a lot of research and interest on this, that really has really been growing since the 90s. And since the theory was developed in 78, I find it interesting that there was a little bit of a gap there. But it has grown so much that I found that since 1998, there's been a national conference on transformative learning. Now, certainly it's not based only on Mezirow's work, but it is transformative learning, and there's a whole conference based on this that takes place every year since 98. So I thought that was really interesting. According to the theory, learning is the process of using existing interpretation of an experience to create new, revised interpretations to consider in future actions. So it's a deep theory, and we'll get into it a little bit more, but in short summary, that's what it's all about. It's using this existing interpretation and being able to use that information as we move forward. According to Merriam, Caffarella, and Baumgardner in 2007, important component of Mezirow's theory is the meaning structure, or frame of reference, if you prefer. And this is the structure of assumptions and expectations through which we filter or kind of our sense of our impressions. It gives us the context for making meaning within which we choose how a sensory experience is to be constructed and appropriated. So there's the two dimensions of the frame of reference are habits of mind and point of view. Habit of mind is a set of assumptions that can be broad and generalized, orienting predispositions that behave as a filter for interpreting the meaning of an experience. So, in other words, if you think about this in terms of the different kinds of habits of mind, it's helpful. Those include moral and ethical, philosophical, psychological, and then, of course, we have our generalized predispositions. So the difference between this and point of view is made up of meaning schemes. So they're sets of immediate, specific beliefs, feelings, attitudes, and value judgments. Another way to think about the difference between these is that point of view is something that we can change more easily because we're getting feedback and more aware of our point of view than we are of our habits of mind. So in other words, habits of mind, we may not actually really realize that it's a habit of mind until somebody points it out or we're in a situation where we have really reflected upon it and realized that that is in fact the case. Transformative learning is when we take our taken for granted frames of reference, so our habits of mind, our mindsets, and we make them more discriminating and capable of change and reflective so they can generate beliefs that will prove more true or justified to guide action. So we're freed from our uncritical acceptance of others, which I think is really an interesting statement. And again, this is from Merriam et al. Because what it does is when we look at our acceptance or perhaps our unacceptance by others, and we've had transformative learning, we're really going to think about, well, what does that mean? And it becomes more complicated and more important to us or less important to us because we're looking at it deeper than whether or not they're accepting us. There are 4 components to Mezirow's theory, and those include experience, critical reflection, reflective discourse, and action. So experience would be the learner's experiences that they bring into the situation and consider in the learning process. Critical reflection, we have to really critically reflect on our assumptions and beliefs that structured how the experience has been interpreted. So this creates a revision of some of the assumptions about ourselves or others until the actual structure of the assumptions becomes transformed, and now we've created a new meaning. So that takes us to the reflective discourse. And this is where now we have our new meaning, and we've got to test it. So what we do is we engage in discourse with others because we're looking for others' opinions on this new meaning that we have created. And we're hoping that that will give us affirmation. It will help us to build a new understanding of this new meaning that we've created. So then the 4th component or step is action. So the thing about action is that it can take a lot of different forms. So it can be immediate or it can be delayed. It can be an affirmation of an existing pattern of action that we have. And not only can action vary in the rapidity with which it takes place, but also it can range from anything from making a decision, that affirmation, or I've made a decision, to something, I don't want to say bigger like it's less important, but participating in a protest or doing something, highly active as compared to a decision. All important. I just wanted to emphasize the range of what action can mean. Mezirow defined learning as a process that takes place when we look at something that we have previously experienced or learned and our interpretation of that. And now we're going to kind of reflect on it, review on it, and we end up construing a new or a revised interpretation of that meaning. And then what we're going to do is, with that new meaning, we're going to use that as a guide as we move forward. So you can see how when we talked about the 4 components of Mezirow's theory, how those sounded like steps, and they were indeed in order. But there's actually 10 steps to Mezirow's theory that incorporate those components that we just discussed. Those 10 steps start with a disorienting dilemma. And this can be any number of things, as you can imagine. It could be suddenly being out of work, or suddenly learning that now you need to further your education if you want to keep your job, or life situations where you suddenly find yourself unmarried or widowed, suddenly taking care of other members of your family that you hadn't been before. But any kind of a life event where suddenly your world is kind of rocked and now everything is about to change. So that's going to start then with your self-examination. So the idea here is kind of what it sounds like, where you're really looking at yourself. So you're not just looking at the situation that you suddenly found yourself in, but you're really looking at yourself. And of course, then, this is going to be emotional. So it can involve fear. What is in the future for me? How did that happen? And, I'm scared it's going to happen again. Angry. Like, how dare this person do this to me? leave me in financial dire straits. I'm mad. I'm mad about this, and really, just really internalizing what your situation is and how you are in that situation. It can even involve shame. Like, I'm so embarrassed that this happened to me. I can't even talk to anybody about it. So, there are a lot of emotions that go into that self examination. It's not just looking at the facts and trying to analyze them. That self examination step can continue into step 3, which is where you really get into your critical assessment of your assumptions. So you're past your initial shock, maybe a little past your anger and your fear, and now you're starting to look at things differently, maybe even more positively. So yeah, your world just got flipped upside down. But now, what's ahead of you in the future, and how might things be better for you, even though this terrible thing has happened? And so you start to feel a little more positive about the road ahead, and you start moving forward a little bit. And that will take you to step 4, which is that you realize that you're not alone. This can be a difficult step if you are a little more introverted and not really maybe sharing with others, or really looking around to see what else is going on in the world around you that's similar to your world that you're experiencing right then. But if you are sharing, if you are talking, if you are looking, chances are you're going to find out you're not alone at all. There are others who have had similar experiences. And so with that comes this affirmation. It's kind of relieving that, you're not the only one that this has happened to, that other people are dealing with the same thing. It's not only the affirmation, but you may learn from the others how they dealt with it. You may learn how they dealt with it and decide that's not at all the path that you want to take. But it's this opportunity for you to kind of step out of your only thinking internally about you and your situation, and realizing that there are others there that you can learn from, or select to not learn from. And that's going to take you on to step 5, which is where you begin to explore what your options are. So, okay, now I'm in my new life, and say it's something that was, a relationship issue that now you're on your own. Well, okay, what do I do in this new role? Well, I can go back to school. I can change jobs. I can do a lot of things differently now, because now I'm the one primarily making the decisions for my life. If you were in a previous relationship that wasn't the case, that's a new role for you. And maybe my new role is going to include, like I mentioned, going back to school. I'm not going to just be someone who goes to work every day. I'm going to go to school at night too. My new role, I'm going to be really active learner. In the actions that you take, going back to school, applying for promotion, things like this, you're really looking at what these options are for putting you in new roles in your life. What are these options? What do I want to do? And these end up coming together to help you form a new plan. Steps 6 through 9 of Mezirow's theory's 10 steps are all about the plan. So this is where we are acquiring our knowledge and our skills. We've tried on those new roles. How does it feel to go back to school? What is it like to be the person that gets to make all the decisions at home? Whatever our new situation is, we've tried on those new roles. And we're renegotiating our relationships. So we're really changing almost everything in our life. And we're building competence in those new roles. We're getting better at going back to school, what it's like balancing your time and studying. What's it like being in a different type of a relationship? We're just kind of not only moving forward in creating the plan, now we're actually living the plan. We're actually doing it. And what is that like? And so we get to this point now where we think we have it all figured out. And still, though, we haven't quite finished the process because we've kind of stepped away from our life a little bit while we were going through steps 1 through 9. We have to go through step 10 if we want to achieve full transformative learning, and that is reintegration. Because what's going to happen is now we're stepping back into our life. There's parts of our lives that we had kind of stepped away from. And we're going to go back in, and based on our new transformed perspective, we're going to go back into our life and see how things go now. So we've actually had a transformative experience by going through all 10 of those steps. Miriam, Caffarella, and Baumgartner gave a really good example of Mezirow's transformative learning theory in practice. They gave an example of a woman named Karen who returned to college as an adult. And Karen had always had trouble with math, and she just felt that she was just not inclined to be a good student. And never really thought anything else about it. But nevertheless, she decided to go ahead and try to go to college and get her degree. But once she did, she started having problems, and so she was thinking about withdrawing. But she was doing so well in other classes that one of her professors suggested that maybe she should be tested for a learning disability. Well, of course, that kind of threw her into a whole nother way of thinking she hadn't considered. And when she learned that, in fact, she had a learning challenge, she was, of course, experiencing what Mezirow described as the disorienting dilemma. Oh my goodness, what is this? My world has just been rocked. I am not the person I thought I was. And it kind of talks about the components too there that Mezirow had mentioned about how you have feelings of shame, embarrassment. And it's emotional when you go through this disorienting dilemma. Karen decided to look for ways that she could stay in school. So she started going into that self-examination step. Now she's in step 2. I really need to look at myself. And this is the part, what I had mentioned earlier, that can be positive. So even though Karen could have been depressed, she could have wanted to quit because she learned that she had this learning challenge. Instead, she started looking at things more positively. Like, look what I've been able to accomplish so far, in spite of this challenge that I have that I didn't even know I had. And now that I know about it, and now that I'm learning what I can do about it, wow, the road ahead is looking a lot more positive for Karen. So she actually went through an assessment. She went through the testing. She really looked at her situation. She moved on through step 3 and got to step 4, where she started looking around and found others who had similar learning disabilities. And they actually formed a support group, and it was really wonderful for Karen to have that affirmation that she was not alone, and also to be working with a group of others that had a positive mission, if you will. They worked together to raise awareness and change attitudes of others, other learners, and maybe some instructors on the campus about learning disabilities. So she's really flipped this around to make this a more positive experience. So she's clearly moved into step 5, where she's looking at options, forming a new plan for her life. So that disorienting dilemma started all of this, and now she's moved through steps 5. She's into steps 6 through 9, where she is, she's acquired the knowledge about how she needs to approach learning, about how she can help others with her challenges. She's renegotiated relationships. She's formed this whole support group. So she's really moving along in steps 6 through 9, building competence, because now she's becoming an advocate for others, let alone for her own education from what she's learned. So she's moved through all of this, and now she just needs to, I don't mean just like it's a simple thing, but now she has to go through step 10, which is to reintegrate into her life with this new perspective and this new knowledge that she has gained. And with what she has gone through, she's actually become a spokesperson for people, not just an advocate, which is really something, but she's become a spokesperson and changing other people's attitudes. And so in this way, we can see by looking at Karen how one can start in step 1 with this dramatic event that for some of us might stop us there, but instead she moves forward all the way through to step 10 and has had a transformative learning experience. So now that we've looked at, albeit quite briefly, Mezirow's transformative learning theory, I think it's important to look at the benefits of transformative learning. Certainly, on the top of the list is student success. And what I mean by this is that the student actually is able to learn, really use the knowledge rather than just, as we said earlier in this presentation, be able to regurgitate it on an exam and get an A, but actually you really use this knowledge to succeed. Yes, it does include an A in class, but beyond that, it means being able to have that transformative learning and actually have a new life experience because of the learning that has taken place. Certainly, institutional effectiveness is an important benefit. This relates to things that they are looking at, the Institute is looking at for success. It can include measurements of persistence, success of students in moving forward and getting jobs, increased enrollment. There are a variety of things that can be rated by an institution that transformative learning can have a positive effect upon. And then, of course, going back to where we started, social change, which is so important in education. And social change, what's interesting about that is that not only is it can be a result of transformative learning, it does share some components that we've already talked about in Mezirow's theory. Becoming aware of a need to change is one of the first steps in order for social change to take place. So one must critically reflect on assumptions and biases. Sound familiar? Solidarity is equally important for social change to take place. So that reminds me of Mezirow's theory about realizing that in one of the steps you need to realize that you're not alone. Others before you share your experiences and your beliefs. And then the third part of social change is being able to discern what actions are needed. So you learn through your reflection. Again, this is similar to Mezirow's theory because now we're looking at how we can use this information and what is the best way for us to be able to move forward. Now that we've looked at the benefits of transformative learning, I think it's important that we look at the considerations for creating or nurturing a transformative learning environment. Let's start with the challenges. So first, there is access. And this certainly is not an inclusive list. But when it comes to access, things to think about are things that maybe you wouldn't think about. For example, in an American classroom setting, one might not think about transportation being an issue. If you're in an urban environment, maybe it isn't. But if you're where I live in a rural environment, transportation certainly can be a major consideration. There are no buses, there are no taxis. So if I need to get to class and my car breaks down, walking wouldn't get me to school for probably a couple days. Another thing about access that we may not always think about is technology. I'm not talking about who has the latest iPad. I'm talking about some things that have become basics for today in America. Where I live, there's no cable. Where I live, there's no Wi-Fi except for from my phone, and my phone doesn't necessarily work in every room. And so these are things that, we may not always think about, but they certainly can be challenges for creating a really good learning environment. Diversity, of course, is always very important too. At the same time, it adds to the richness to the class and the experience for everyone, teachers and learners. Diversity also can come with some things that we really need to make sure we pay attention to beyond what we normally may think of. And that is actually can be about the relationship or the representation, if you will, of dominant and subdominant. So, for example, if you are in an environment that geographically speaking is of, for the most part, a particular ethnicity or race, and then the educator is of a completely different ethnicity or race, then how is that relationship in the classroom? Because there might be some confusion in communication and buy-in. So it's more complicated than what we may always think about, and really, really important to take into consideration. And identifying other barriers is actually a consideration, because it can be easy for us to not know what the challenges are for the educational institution, the educators, the learners. So being able to have a means for identifying what barriers might be in existence that could cause a problem with creating an effective transformative learning environment. Also, in our considerations, we need to think about our approaches. For example, I want to mention that as far as expectations go and timing, the research that I did for this presentation really led me to believe that this isn't something that can happen overnight, and that's okay then if it doesn't. So we need to approach this as something that may take time to create, but it certainly will be worth it when we're successful. Another thing about the approaches is learner-centered programming. Earlier, when we talked about Freire's liberation theory, we were talking about how there is that the role between the educator and the learners gets switched back and forth. It's really creating this learner-centered environment where the students have say. They are an important part of how the class is constructed and held, because that's what it's all about, is the learners being able to have successful transformative learning. So they need to be involved in the process. And then another approach is persistence evaluations. So really being able to look at not just what the persistence levels are, but why. Why are some students remaining in class all the way through and being successful to graduation, and why are others not? And what is going on there, and really being able to evaluate that will take you back up to your challenges and being able to identify other barriers. So that will end our presentation on transformative learning. Just to kind of recap, we gave a definition of transformative learning and how it's really about a dramatic change in how we see ourselves and the world in which we live. We talked about theories. Cranton had really focused a lot on Dirks's four lenses and how this theory, the transformative learning theory, is a theory in process. And then we went in much deeper into Mezirow's theory, including the four components and the 10 steps of transformative learning. We talked about the benefits and then the considerations that we want to make sure that we bear in mind as we are trying to create successful transformative learning environments, the challenges and the approaches. And so with those considerations, I'd like to leave you with one parting thought. So now that we've covered transformative learning, how will you create a transformative learning environment at your institution? And if one already exists, how will you nurture it, maintain it, and ensure transformative learning for your students